Next up is Niall Murphy. Niall Murphy, I'm just very happy to see again on stage, so to speak, who's going to be talking about the unreasonable effectiveness of not doing DevOps, right? We talk a lot about how DevOps makes us more efficient, how we can optimize with the DevOps, so we can do the DevOps and be better. But what if it's the inverse of that, right? What if we're not doing DevOps? What does that mean? Okay. It's in many senses gathered mindshare, momentum as a movement, right? But a difficult question has to be asked. Why have so many implementations failed? Right? So, what can we learn from those failures? Niall Murphy, thank you so much for joining us on the stream today.
Hi, could everyone see and hear me? By everyone, I do, of course, mean the presenter. Awesome. Okay, sorry, just how my setup works, I can't see you folks. So thank you very much for the introduction. I just wanted to say, well, first of all, acknowledgements, right? So thank you to the many other thinkers and commentators and speakers and Twitter respondents, etc., whose thoughts I have shamelessly plundered for this. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the special circumstances of this situation and my special respect for the indomitable spirit of the Ukrainian people in their current situation. I'm telling you that I would not be able to organize a conference in a war zone, let alone all of the other things that are happening. So I am super, I want to make that super clear that I really support this, and I'm honored by this opportunity to present. So if you've heard of me, these things are probably why I instigated the Esri books at Google and have spoken at a bunch of other DevOps and Esri conferences and so on. I suppose in some sense, I probably identify slightly more as coming from an Esri background, having spent like 11 years in Google than a DevOps background as such, but these things are very strongly interrelated, and I'm not drawing a line between the communities, and I think we have a lot to say to each other and all of that kind of stuff. Anyway, fine. Context. So there is a mild pun, or like the reason I'm using this title is because of this paper from 1960, which is called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences. Great title. By this chap called Eugene Wigner. And basically the thing behind the paper is it's actually kind of a bit weird that mathematics is so effective in the natural sciences. And he has this great example of showing something to a classmate and discussing, as it might be, population distribution, and then the pi symbol turns up somewhere in that, and people are asking, like, why does pi have anything to do with population distribution? And he's saying we have no real right to expect that the vocabulary and the concepts of mathematics necessarily would help us as much as they do in the natural sciences, physics in particular, I suppose, at this time, when we're trying to describe stuff. And even though we have moved on a little bit since then, and there's a lot of kind of conversations about social construction of scientific value and so on and so forth, it's still an interesting point. And the reason why I use it in this talk is to say, or to examine the question of, as you open the introduction, like, doing DevOps actually seems to have some difficulties, and why, if it's so good, do we see companies able to not do DevOps for quite a long while and possibly indefinitely? Anyway, I have to get onto that shortly. So 1960 and fast forward 48 years, and we have a thing called DevOps, which I will not rehearse the basics of here, but I suppose the main point is we think we have a thing that works better than other ways of doing it. Actually, in fact, we have some extremely strong numerical evidence that it does. And I won't go through every element on this slide, I suppose, but there's a couple of things I would pull out. The first one is that according to the most recent DORA report issuing from Google in 2021, if I recall correctly, you get an average business performance improvement reported from the teams kind of doing high level, highly effective DevOps or SRE. You get 1.8 improvement in average business performance, which is actually pretty considerable. Like, that's way bigger than the profit margin of most companies. So there's definitely something going on here. And I mean, that's at a company level, right? But on an individual level, when you go and ask DevOps practitioners what they're doing and how well they're doing and so on and so forth, generally speaking, they're satisfied with their job. So, okay, admittedly, it's 2019 that 88% of DevOps specialists are not actively looking for a job. Like, I suspect that number might be a bit lower these days, or there's been a lot of chaos and churn, but definitely DevOps roles have continued to be in strong demand, and was, I think, in the top 8 in Q1 2021 and so on. So anyway, there's some pretty strong kind of numerical evidence related to the DORA surveys and a bunch of other things you can find if you go looking that doing DevOps, lots of evidence that DevOps style interventions can produce pretty startling results. And yet, coming to the crisis, the theme of the conference, kind of DevOps in crisis, we also have some pretty strong numerical evidence that DevOps implementations are kind of pretty hard, and there's some difficulties in doing them. And also, I would argue by implication that the old or bad way of doing things kind of works maybe okay enough. So why change? Which is a huge question. So I suppose the contra case, numerical evidence that DevOps doesn't work. I mean, this might not be the practice. Like, this might be kind of DevOps implementations or projects inside a company or transformation projects. But you can more or less find any kind of Gartner report or Forrester or whatever that will tell you that most DevOps transformation projects fail in some sense. Like, either you don't, as this sector over here says, either you don't realize the full value, or like they just flat out fail, or you have a kind of an orphan team left behind, etc. I've seen numbers from 75 to 90. So there's some pretty damning numbers there. Another thing I would highlight in this list is that a question from Second Watch survey, or a point from Second Watch survey, which is to say 22% of organizations are doing DevOps in its purest form, like only 22%. Of course, there's a question mark about what in the purest form means, and that kind of policing is a bit interesting in a DevOps cultural context, I would think. But there seems to be a lot of room for improvement. And that's particularly pertinent in the case of the Puppet 2021 report, which states that when you look at the respondents and you kind of characterize them as kind of high level, mid level, low level in terms of their DevOps journey, you see that about 78% of them, like plus or minus a percent of the respondents, are in mid level in some sense, like doing okay, like maybe there's a mid upper and a mid lower and so on. But broadly speaking, they're doing okay. And there's only really a percent or thereabouts of leakage kind of into the high category, or thereabouts. Might even be some leakage into the low category, I suppose. But that remaining continuous for 4 years gives us some indication that actually maybe there's something not quite right here, and this is difficult. So taking that in mind, or having the top level in mind there, I suppose the section on the bottom row I would highlight is the resistance to change piece, the resistance to change in DevOps implementations at this mid-level comes from every kind of organizational level. It's roughly evenly split as well, like about the same kind of proportion of VPs, line managers, and ICs are kind of resisting implementing DevOps. Now, like, there's kind of two paths we could take from here. I think the first thing to note, of course, is that DevOps kind of hard to do as a practice. Implementing DevOps transformation projects are also known to be hard. In fact, more or less any change project is hard to do. There's some statistics suggesting 70% of any kind of change project big enough to be worthy of the topic or the name change project fails. As an experienced corporate warrior, I would believe that number. There are lots of folks who talk about how to improve those rates, the success rates, when you're kind of in the middle of the transformation, like what do you tactically do, all of which are very valuable. But I don't propose to do that right here. Instead, I'm going to talk about something a bit different, which is to look at why it's so successful to not do it. And here I think the ideas I'm using to help illustrate DevOps transformation projects are really kind of lessons from economics. And in particular, I'm talking about externalities, and a closely related concept, but I'm tucking it under kind of externalities about misaligned incentives, right? Incentives being the key piece of one of the key I suppose, concepts or paradigms of economics, which, by the way, I have no training in whatsoever. So do please take all of this with a grain of salt. But I've been interested in it for a long time. Another concept is market failure or pricing failure, which I think is particularly interesting in the internal to the corporation angle, and also kind of why do firms exist is this famous question in economics. Why do silos exist is kind of my corresponding question. So to introduce folks to this concept, if you haven't already come across it, externalities are things when you perform some kind of economic activity and things that have negative or positive effects on third parties that aren't actually a part of the economic transaction you were in theory doing. I think the two interesting examples here, or two illustrative examples, are first of all kind of pollution. This is a huge piece in climate change. Running the machines in your factory to make your widgets and polluting the environment in order to do that is a benefit for you who are running the machines, because you get to make your widgets and sell your stuff and make money and so on. And it's a net cost to more or less everyone else. And that is a negative externality. And a positive externality is when some kind of activity, as I say, causing a benefit to a third party. An example of this would be, wearing your mask on public transport or whatever. You, the person who has bought the mask, are paying a cost for the mask and, the inconvenience of wearing it, et cetera, and the benefit is primarily caused to third parties. So with that in mind, we should take a look at the question of externalities in the corporate world, not necessarily for companies between each other, but kind of within a company. So coming back to the question of these externalities, recasting it slightly, a negative externality, doing something which is good for you or the team. I'll kind of bunch them together slightly a little bit here, but bad for the company. And positive externality is doing something which is bad for you, your team or whatever, but good for the company. And so when we think about, our day-to-day work in this context and think about, what things am I doing that are, maybe slightly better for the company or quite a bit better for me or whatever, I think it opens up a universe of fascinating discussions about how it is we do the work we do and what is valued. In particular, like trying to think about some concrete examples, there's good for the team and bad for the company. So kind of friction with other teams would be potentially good for the team if you're in some fight with another team and you cause them to fail in what they're doing, or you impose enough friction, like maybe you're blocking them from achieving it. You could maybe win in a fight with them and take their project and make a success and so on. All of which is, wonderful corporate drama, but actually, is it bad for the company? It's pretty bad for the company. Like, you wasted a lot of energy in that friction that you could have spent on other things. So actually, that's not good. So bad for the team and good for the company is, things like, winding up the team because there's a piece of infra you're managing that you no longer need to do that because you've kind of automated it out of existence or moved to another thing or whatever. So in some sense, that's an existential question. But actually, another potentially bad for the team, good for the company piece is measurement. So you're measuring things maybe that show your team isn't doing a hugely good job. So it's much better for the company to know this because you can do something about it. It's much worse for you. So that's a question. So I'm going to make a crazy claim here for a moment, which is to say that on an individual level, something that's bad for you and good for the company might be doing DevOps. So you're working on cross-functional stuff. You're trying to share. You're trying to like bind silos together, get communication flowing, improve things for other folks, and so on. Interesting thing is that in many, I suppose, corporate environments today, we overload the attribute of caring about holistic things with being higher up the corporate ladder. So VPs get to care about the health of the whole thing, and ICs or line managers or whatever don't. In fact, most of the caring about the whole thing is really strongly concentrated. And our performance management and our promotion kind of mechanisms and systems don't really reward this behavior, or at least if they do reward it, they might not reward it in the right way. And part of the reason here, I suppose, is to come back to the economics analogy, is that we have market failures or we've pricing failures. So market failure definition is that individual incentives are not leading to good kind of group outcomes, which I think is very clear in some of those previous discussions, but also mispricing. So again, by analogy, mispricing the cost and benefit of DevOps activities is maybe what leads to them being undervalued in the corporate environment. So asking this question, what's a benefit to the team and a cost to the company? What's a benefit to the company, cost to your team, and so on, would be hugely powerful in framing certain kinds of promotion cases, because you can show where you have deliberately kind of sacrificed, in some sense, your forward progress in your narrow silo in order to benefit others, which is actually kind of VP level thinking. So you're kind of demonstrating the thinking of levels above. Or, a slightly stronger way of putting it, the thesis would be that lack of progress in DevOps transformation, it's a market failure at the end of the day, or, pricing failure. And, economically, rationally speaking, it's right to not do DevOps if success isn't understood and measured in the right way, in terms of CAMs and so on. So what does economic theory tell us about externalities? Like, what can we do about externalities? Well, there's a couple of different approaches. There's one very famous one by an economist at the Chicago School called Coase, who basically says, okay, part of the problem with externalities, coming back to the pollution example, the difficulty of the pollution situation, he says, is because no one owns the air. And if somebody did own the air, they would be in a position to kind of defend their property rights. And so the kind of clearest example you can get about this is there's a farmer polluting a stream, and there's some kind of downstream, end quote, water user who's being inconvenienced by this pollution. But if the water could be said to be definitively owned by that downstream user, well, then they could bribe, or pay the farmer to produce less pollution. But actually, that kind of intervention is not hugely common, and you tend to see the other two things a lot more, and in particular, pricing policy, taxes and subsidies, and quantity regulation. Okay, it would be dangerous, for the environment if you made 10,000 of these, so you can make 1,000 of them, or similar. So bringing this back to the corporate context, and in particular, behavior rewarding and promotion and so on, what could an organization do about these externalities in order to make DevOps kind of more palatable to what it's doing? And of course, like classic examples, subsidy and tax, we can subsidize cross-functional and kind of CAMS compliant behavior. How do we do that? Like, obviously in the economics world, you're going to talk a lot about money and kind of promotion and rewards and so on. But obviously as well, in a human organization, that is way less than the totality of the behavior that's rewarded and so on and so forth. A cultural incentivization or subsidization, in some sense, I would argue, is you raise up engineers or ICs or whatever who are behaving in DevOps style ways, and you are public about what they can achieve, and you help smooth the path for them to achieve what they do. And this kind of cultural incentivization, modeling the behavior, makes it more likely, and calling out the behavior positively makes it more likely to be able to be reproduced inside the organization. Of course, while you're doing these kinds of things, you have to bear in mind Goodhart's law as well, which is to say that when you have some kind of measure which becomes a target, then people kind of hyper optimize the measure, and it becomes no longer a good control surface. And so I argue that we should focus on correcting bad incentives, of which there are a very large amount, particularly in kind of zero-sum corporate cultures, rather than trying to make kind of complex positive schemes. So iron out the obviously bad things first of all, and part of that is this thing we hear about, which is work as it's actually done versus work as how it's imagined by, in particular, folks writing, I suppose, promotion and reward schemes, for which there might be very, very different ideas of what work is. But if you iron out the bad ones, you're in a good situation. So another relevant question, I suppose, to how it's possible for silos to keep being relevant, and for non-DevOps style behavior to keep being relevant. Why do silos exist? And actually they have a lot of advantages in many ways. I think they're simpler, of course. When you're kind of cutting scope to manage complexity, that just makes it more tractable, and measurement is easier and a whole bunch of other things is easier. But it also fosters kind of ideas of specialized labor, and kind of birds of a feather kind of flock together, as we say in English, which means that it's easier for people who are doing the same kind of professional work to kind of live beside each other and learn from each other, and so on. And generally speaking, coordination costs are lower within a silo, which can be quite interesting. But ultimately, kind of the larger, very high level question is, why can firms continue to do inefficient things or like non-DevOps stuff and still have that kind of turn out okay? And I suppose I've two answers to that, other than, there's a lot of other answers we could have, but there's a certain amount of economic center of gravity in all established organizations, really, which is to say that once you can operate at a profit, kind of change is hard. People are still going to keep coming to you in order to buy the thing that solves the problem for them. Again, we have another concept in economics called opportunity cost, which is the great thing you could have done if you didn't do the thing you did in fact do. And it's hard to sell people on counterfactuals. It's particularly hard to sell, I suppose, very strongly kind of hard-nosed VP level folks on questions like, well, we could have, we could operate at way more of a profit if we did this difficult and expensive thing with a very high chance of failure. Like, that's not often a discussion that goes well. And in some sense, also the profit margin that you are making in your organization is the room for doing inefficient things. And an interesting observation that I will just drop here is that most SaaS businesses, unlike, retail or other kind of very common low margin businesses where it's like 4 or 5% kind of margin, most SaaS businesses, most enterprise businesses maybe, are in the 70% profit margin range, which means there's an awful lot of room for doing stuff that isn't that efficient when you have those kinds of margins. So what could we do? We can change the incentives. In particular, we can iron out the bad ones. We can also construct positive ones, of course. But coming back even to the principles of CAMS, we can say measure and expose to real organizational mechanisms our behavior. So we can reward the good stuff and unreward the bad stuff. And good luck in your DevOps journey. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for that insightful talk. A lot of, I guess, a lot of meat in there, right? A lot of stuff
Yes.
that you really sink your teeth into. I feel like, for me, when I was listening to that and looking at your slides, you were just getting started on a thing before you moved to the next thing, and I already have so many questions. Right? It's a big topic, right? Like there's a lot to
Yes.
go over there. So while we wait for the audience to filter in with their questions, of course, I'll give you one of my own, and that is, how do you know when it didn't work?
Yeah, great question. And of course, coming back to all of those points about work as done versus work as imagined and the incentives for lying and so on and so forth, it can be really hard, even in a situation where it is easy to communicate vulnerability to the rest of your organization. Really hard to figure out what is actually good and what success means. Most practitioners that have been successful in this that I have met and spoken to have mentioned two things. First of all, super specific, super concrete goals that are, like, maybe if the goal is far out or aspirational or whatever, you have really strongly defined milestones and the measurement piece that we keep coming back to. So for example, you start out with the ambition to install a CI/CD system and to have some percentage of all changes flowing through it by date X. Now, of course, you can end up in questions like, okay, well, it wasn't quite date X, but it was date X plus a month or whatever. All right, fine. We can declare kind of limited success or progress or whatever in those circumstances. And I don't think folks would get too upset unless there's some kind of blocking kind of product related deadline, etc. But I'll say that one interesting way to answer this question is to actually look at the Dorometric surveys themselves, look at those questions and see if your own scores of those answers are improving over time, because that kind of measures kind of, in some sense, background, cultural change rate, and things which maybe aren't hugely specifically tactical, but do in some sense measure the background radiation or temperature of your org and how well it's doing at adopting to these ideas, which are, at the end of the day, kind of inherently hard to measure. But proxies are available.
Fair enough. So we have a question here from the audience. The problem with changing the reward structure for inefficiency is that it's often the inefficient management that controls the rewards. There's a bit of bias, in that statement, but it's not necessarily incorrect. That's certainly something that could occur. Is there a way to, if not necessarily counteract that, at least to be aware of it, to be able to call it out?
Yeah, I think there's actually a wider array of responses to this that are available than most people think. I think I will tell you this story because it is an Irish funny story, and I don't necessarily mean that all of the viewers should go out and do this, but there was one grandmother who was known to be like not a terribly nice person, and she was going to write all of the other people out of her will, except for one child who was the favorite. And all of the other children got together and signed a legally binding document saying, whenever one of us gets the bequest from the grandmother, we will all divide it equally between us, which obviously involves a certain amount of sacrifice on the part of like one person, but that person clearly said to themselves, look, I could take this money and pollute my relationship with my siblings for the next 25 years, or I could trade this stuff. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting necessarily that anyone on the team agrees after the manager awards stuff that they will split up the thing. But if the control surface is kind of polluted in various ways, you can agitate for the control surface to be changed, or you can put yourself in the control surface. And actually, I've heard of a number of successes of folks who have gotten themselves promoted into the managerial position precisely so that they could change what gets rewarded.
That is not a bad strategy, right? Be the change. Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, yeah, why not? That makes sense. That makes sense. So, again, if there's some more questions from the audience that, want to roll in, there's still a little bit of time left, everybody. One of the things that this is bringing up for me, at least, we're talking about, how to identify these, problems, so on and so forth, is that some of these things are systemic, right? And they're going to just be part of how an organization is structured. Now, that could be larger societal issues and so on and so forth, and that's fine. That we could talk at that level. But even just within a smaller organization, something Kelsey mentioned earlier, right, is that in any given company, we do it this way because we do it this way, right? And we have definitions of success because that's how we've always defined them. We have ways of measuring failure because we've always measured them. That is there value to that tradition? Is overcoming that inertia, should that be the default? What's the balance there?
Yeah, so in general, in previous institutions, I have been a change agent, so I have a huge amount of sympathy for that side of the ledger and not very much sympathy for the other side of the ledger. But I'll say two things. First of all, that part of the resistance to change on that level that you're talking about can be, the recipient of the change is necessary message going, oh, like, I don't want to change all of this organization at once, or I don't want to have to explain to all of my reports, et cetera, et cetera. I could handle one of them, or, we could do it in February, or those kinds of things. And sometimes we could do it in February we'll never do it. And I understand that. But people in general, if you confront is the wrong word, if you present them with reasonable numerical evidence that the thing in fact works, which is one of the things that I think is so inspiring about DevOps in particular, actually, that we do have that evidence. If you present them with that evidence and you say, we will start a trial, we will start a pilot, we will, in other words, create a small bubble in which different rules apply, and then we will move things across the surface of that bubble into the new world, and the new world expands. People are generally way more able to handle incrementalism in that kind of situation than they are, okay, we're going to take everything, shake it, and put it back onto the table in its new configuration. There are comparatively few people who enjoy that situation, particularly if they are closer to the top.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Well, thank you so much for taking the time out to share with us. As I said, there's just so much there that I think it would be worth certainly diving into, certainly learning more about. I see that you're currently exploring startup opportunities. So if anybody out there is interested in exploring startup opportunities with Niall, I think he would be interested and receptive having you reach out to him.
Well, let me say, I am actually starting a startup, and that is the startup opportunity I was exploring.
Very good.
More soon,
okay.
More soon. All
right. Okay, very good. Well, thank you so much for taking the time out to share with us. It's always a pleasure to hear from you, and really look forward to speaking with you again on upcoming DevOps days. Thank you very much.